Today, we're doing something a little different. We are prying open Hollywood's vault to explore the cinematic ghosts of the DC universe. These are the epic films that were planned, developed, and in some cases even finished, but that you will probably never, ever get to see. For every superhero blockbuster that you see smash its way onto the big screen, there are dozens of alternate timelines. These parallel universes where different actors wore the cape, where some truly bizarre stories were told, and where entire cinematic universes rose and fell without a single ticket ever being sold. These are the stories of those phantom films, the echoes of a DC universe that could have been.
All right, here's what we're going to cover. We'll start with the solo films for the biggest heroes that just stumbled right at the starting line. Then we'll zoom out and see how these grand universe-spanning plans crumbled into dust. We'll check in on the villains who never got their moment in the spotlight, explore the weird and wonderful genre experiments that were denied, and finally get to the most shocking of all, the films that were canceled just inches from the finish line. Let's dive into this multiverse of what could have been.
Okay, we have to start with the giants, the most recognizable what-ifs in comic book movie history. These are the standalone films for DC's most legendary heroes, projects that came so close to redefining these characters for a whole new generation.
So I want you to picture this. It's the late 90s. The idea of an interconnected superhero universe, that's not even a dream yet. And the director famous for his dark, gothic style, Tim Burton, is about to give us his take on the ultimate Boy Scout, Superman.
And this is the wild part. This wasn't just some idea floating around. This was a movie on the verge of creation. Nicolas Cage was officially cast, and you can find these incredible photos of him doing costume tests in this bizarre, almost alien-looking Superman suit with long flowing hair. The studio had already poured millions into pre-production. But just 3 weeks before cameras were set to roll, Warner Brothers got cold feet over the skyrocketing budget and just pulled the plug. The project died, but its legend has only grown, especially because of the infamous detail that a giant mechanical spider was going to be a key villain, an idea the producer was so obsessed with, he later forced it into the movie Wild Wild West. No joke.
Okay, let's fast forward a couple of decades. After Ben Affleck made his big debut as this grizzled, world-weary Batman, he was basically given the keys to the Batmobile. He was all set to write, direct, and star in his own standalone adventure, one that promised a really deep psychological dive into the detective side of the character. Now, this film would have been a real test for the Dark Knight. The whole idea was to pit his brilliant mind against one of his most formidable strategic and physical foes, the deadly assassin Deathstroke. The plan was to create a dark, gritty, street-level thriller that really put the focus back on Batman's skills as the world's greatest detective, as Deathstroke systematically just dismantled Bruce Wayne's life, both in and out of the cowl.
We even have these little glimpses of what could have been, like this description of a major action sequence from Joe Manganiello, the actor who was set to play Deathstroke. But, as exciting as it all sounded, it just wasn't meant to be. Affleck, citing immense personal struggles and the absolutely crushing pressure of the role, eventually stepped away from the project, and the studio then chose not to just find a new director, but to reboot the character completely, which is what eventually paved the way for Matt Reeves and Robert Pattinson's very different version of the Batman.
But here's the thing. It wasn't just individual films that were falling apart. Sometimes the entire architecture of a planned universe just collapses, taking dozens of potential projects right down with it. And this is where these big creative visions meet the harsh reality of corporate strategy.
This timeline. Man, this really tells the whole story, doesn't it? It gets right to the heart of the problem that plagued so many of these films: constant instability. The DC Extended Universe, or DCEU, was in this perpetual state of retooling and second-guessing. After the disappointing box office of 2017's Justice League, the studio's entire strategy shifted. Then, the surprise release of the Snyder Cut in 2021 hinted at a potential return to the original vision, only for a complete corporate overhaul to wipe the slate clean and start all over again. Projects were announced and then canceled based on which way the corporate winds were blowing that week, leaving creators and fans with total whiplash.
And nothing, I mean nothing, captures this chaos better than the fate of Zack Snyder's planned sequels. That 4-hour Snyder Cut of Justice League wasn't just a director's cut, it was basically a massive 4-hour trailer for a multi-film epic, an epic that the studio had already officially canceled years earlier. And make no mistake, this was a fully plotted out saga.
Snyder had this grand 5-film arc in vision that would have taken us deep into that apocalyptic nightmare future we kept glimpsing in his films. This desolate wasteland ruled by a mind-controlled, grief-stricken Superman under the thumb of the cosmic tyrant Darkseid. It would have seen a final, desperate alliance of the remaining heroes, and even some villains, fighting to reclaim their broken world. It was a bold, definitive, and, dark vision that Warner Bros. Ultimately just decided to abandon completely.
All right, so it wasn't just the good guys who had their stories cut short. For a while there, the studio was actively exploring the idea of giving some of DC's most complex and compelling villains their own time in the spotlight, moving beyond the usual hero-led movies.
And just look at the incredible range of tones they were exploring here. It's night and day. On one hand, you had a hard R, brutally violent Deathstroke origin story from Gareth Evans, the director of the legendary action film The Raid. It promised some of the most intense fight choreography you'd ever see in a comic book movie. And on the other hand, you had this pitch-black satirical comedy, Harley Quinn versus the Joker, described as being like Bad Santa for mentally deranged people. I mean, it literally opened with Harley kidnapping Dr. Phil to force the toxic couple into therapy. Just wild.
So, why didn't we get to see these? Well, the reasons are a perfect example of Hollywood's shifting priorities. The brutal Deathstroke film was seen as too expensive and too niche for a villain's first movie. Meanwhile, that insane Harley/Joker comedy was ultimately sidelined because the studio moved forward with Margot Robbie's vision for Birds of Prey and, of course, the standalone Oscar-winning success of Todd Phillips' Joker. Different, and you could argue safer, paths were chosen, leaving these fascinating ideas just sitting on the cutting room floor.
Okay, now we're getting into the really strange and wonderful corners of the DC universe that almost were. Beyond the traditional capes and cowls, DC was also developing this fascinating slate of films that really pushed the boundaries of the superhero genre, dipping into cosmic fantasy, deep-sea horror, and even absurd comedy.
This list right here, this is a look at a DC universe that could have been incredibly diverse and unpredictable. You had the acclaimed director Ava DuVernay building a sprawling cosmic epic with new gods. James Wan was producing a full-on creature feature horror film, The Trench, spun out of Aquaman. There were long gestating plans for a dark, gothic horror version of Swamp Thing. And maybe the most surprising of all, a live-action Wonder Twins movie was fully cast and just weeks away from filming before it was abruptly canceled. Most of these ended up being casualties of the massive Warner Bros. Discovery merger, which led to a big strategic shift away from streaming-exclusive movies and riskier, less established characters.
And that brings us to the most painful category of all, the most brutal cancellations. These aren't just scripts or cool ideas. These are films that were deep into production, or in one infamous case, already completely finished and ready for an audience to see.
Yeah, we have to talk about Batgirl. This is probably the most notorious story of a canceled movie in modern Hollywood. A nearly $100 million film that was shot, edited, scored, and then locked in a vault, never to be seen by anyone. It exists, but we can't watch it.
And I really want you to understand just how real this movie was. It wasn't stuck in development hell, it was a finished product. Leslie Grace was starring as Barbara Gordon, J.K. Simmons was back as her dad, Commissioner Gordon, and in a huge deal for fans, Michael Keaton reprised his iconic role as Batman for the first time in 30 years. The film was done. Test screenings had already happened. It was right on the verge of release.
So, why will you never see it? In a move that sent absolute shockwaves through the entire industry, the new leadership at Warner Bros. Discovery decided to permanently shelve the completed film, not because it was bad, but reportedly to claim it as a massive tax write-off. It's an accounting maneuver that legally requires that the film can never be commercially released in any form, ever. It was a purely financial decision that basically erased a finished piece of art from existence.
When you look back at all these projects, a clear and, honestly, often heartbreaking picture starts to emerge. The history of DC films is a graveyard of incredible potential. It's a landscape just littered with the ghosts of these bold, creative visions that collided with ever-shifting corporate strategies, sudden budget concerns, and sometimes just pure, dumb, bad luck. For every single movie that makes it to the screen, there are 10 others that become Hollywood folklore.
It all just leaves you wondering, right? What would the superhero movie landscape even look like today if Tim Burton's bizarre Superman had actually taken flight? Or if Ben Affleck's dark detective Batman had stalked the streets of Gotham? Each canceled project is like a door to an alternate reality, a different cinematic universe that now lives on only in scripts, concept art, and in our imaginations, forever a glimpse of what could have been.